seminar. In terms of the notes, if anybody wants a copy of the slides afterwards, please do email either Gemma or myself, and we will send you a copy of the slides for your retention and obviously review at a later date. In terms of the pack, the slides that you can see in front of you, the first few are some marketing information. I realise that some of you have been on these presentations before, whether the previous webinar or you've seen us actually performing live. So a little bit about the company I work for. So I work for DAVENPORT, and we provide support to the engineering and construction industries, basically in a cradle to grave type situation. So we provide upfront services during the course of a live contract, and of course at the end as well. A little bit about the firm itself. We are a market leader in expert witness planning, commercial, technical and dispute avoidance, and of course dispute resolution. Established in 1978, and we're stock market listed. We have over 500 staff working worldwide. Three parts of the business. From the left, you can see we have driver project services, and that's essentially a staff augmentation part of the business. So if you need quantity surveyors or planners on a short, medium or long-term basis, driver project services is the part of the organisation that you could then deal with. The part I work for, as I've already mentioned, is DAVENPORT, and we provide contract advisory services, commercial and contract management, planning and programming, and of course dispute resolution services. On the right hand side, we can see Dialis, which is our expert witness division. Three types of experts that we provide. We've got quantum experts, we've also got planning experts or delay analysts, and then finally we've got technical experts who will deal in things like issues to do with cladding, which obviously come from Grenfell related issues, or where there's defects on jobs, and they can write reports and also stand up in court and give relevant evidence. You'll see on the screen there a lovely, very modern QR code. If you click on the QR code using your camera function on your phone, you can then get to the part of our website that actually has all of our latest digest magazines. And they're available free. So delighted if you wanted to download any of those. Alternatively, you can go to our website. On the screen in front of you is a list of ways that we can help your business. So whether it's reviewing contracts and subcontracts to identify key clauses, risks and obligations, obviously on live contracts, drafting notices. A hugely important thing, which is of course what we're covering today, is the issue of applications for payment and payment notices to make sure that they're sufficiently detailed, the method of service is right, and you're meeting the requirements of the contract. From a programming perspective, obviously looking at baseline and progress programs, assisting in the preparation of compensation events, looking at claims for extensions of time, loss and expense. I think a growing part of the business over the next few months will be our project health check service on live contracts, particularly ensuring that risk is covered. Obviously, if you don't manage to get your particular issues sorted out, we can help you with negotiation, claim preparation and adjudication. We can do bespoke webinars, and we now have a DAVENPORT help desk set up as well if you have any particular queries. I'm sure that there are some other fellow quantity surveyors out there on the seminar today, so hello to all the QSs in the room, and I'm sure there's some other people who are booing at this point as well. So yes, I am in that category of being a quantity surveyor, chartered, ex-BALFOUR BEATTY. I've done a law degree and my solicitor's exams, and I've worked in construction claims consultancy for over 20 years. What are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to start with legislation, just looking at a few of the important parts. A key thing for me whenever I'm talking about payments is looking at the requirements for an application for payment, and in particular, making sure that you've got as many of the boxes ticked as possible. We're also going to look through some case law, and then we're going to end up in looking at some particular bits of advice and things for you guys to watch out for. So starting off with the legislation part, first of all, two main pieces of legislation to be aware of. First of all, we've got the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act 1996. That was then updated through the local Democracy, Economic Development and Construction Act 2009. Together, those two pieces of legislation are generally referred to as the Construction Act. The second piece of legislation essentially updated the first one. The first thing to be aware of when you're looking at this legislation is the fact that whilst the vast majority of construction contracts fall within the Act, there are a number of exclusions. And the exclusions are covered within sections 104, 105 and 106. So taking first of all, sections 104 and 105, if you are involved in drilling for or extraction of oil or natural gas, that is an excluded contract. That doesn't come within the ambit of the Construction Act. In addition, if you're involved in the extraction of minerals, so as an example, the York Potash Mine, that was a project that was ongoing, stopped for a while, and I understand is due to restart. Again, the extraction of minerals, tunnelling or boring, or construction of underground works for this purpose, again, excluded from the Act. The third item down, I'm going to go to the Roman numerals first of all. If the primary activity of the site is item 1, nuclear processing, power generation, or water or effluent treatment, or Roman numeral 2, production, transmission, processing, or bulk storage, other than warehousing, of chemicals, pharmaceuticals, oil, gas, steel, or food and drink, you have to take a little bit more care, because some construction activities on those types of sites are excluded. So if you are involved in the assembly, installation, or the demolition of plant or machinery, or erection or demolition of steelwork for the purposes of supporting or providing access to plant or machinery on those types of sites, then that is excluded from the Act. The final item in section 104, 105 is supply-only contracts. There was an interesting case in the past few months where it talked about whether a concrete delivery actually fell within the Act or outside. Now, on the facts of that particular case, the concrete delivery was seen as a supply-only contract and it was outside the Act. But certainly commentators have said that if that concrete supplier was also supplying the concrete pumps, was also supplying additives that were going into the concrete, actually then that would be more likely to come within the Construction Act itself. One other important exclusion is in section 106, and that's at the exclusion of residential occupiers. Again, there's been a little bit of case law about those types of categories of people. If the residential occupier is going to end up occupying the property themselves, they are excluded from the Act. So anybody who's having some work done on their house, you would be excluded from the Act. However, if you had decided to start up an Airbnb business, quite possibly not the right time to do it as we speak today, but that would still fall within the Construction Act because, of course, you don't intend to actually reside in the property itself. One other important one to be aware of is section 109. Now, this only affects the entitlement to stage payments or interim payments. So if the work on site is going to last under 45 days, then you're not entitled to interim payments. If it's going to last over 45 days, then you are entitled to interim payments. That's section 109. You are still allowed to go to adjudication if you have a dispute. A couple of other clauses to be aware of, and the ones that we're certainly going to major on today. Section 110 of the Act. Now, there are many subsections to this particular part of the legislation. It covers dates for payment. Importantly, it says that every construction contract must have an adequate mechanism for payment. And that includes clear statements about what payments become due and when, and what the final date for payment is, the FDP, the final date for payment. If your contracts don't comply, the scheme for construction contract will fit in. Now that's like a gap filling exercise. So in other words, if just one part isn't applicable or doesn't meet the requirements of the Act, then the scheme for construction contracts will add that little bit in, a bit like a gap filling exercise. Section 110 and 111 also cover the notification. So the application for payment, payment notices, and importantly, pay less notices. Section 112 is certainly where I think that I will have people phoning me, is making sure that if they did decide to suspend work, potentially because of non-payment, that they give a correct notice, and importantly, they also give a 7-day notice period. So you're not paid the amount due by the final date for payment. The following day, you can then issue a notice of suspension. You need to wait 7 clear days, and only then can you suspend. Section 113 is also one to be aware of. In ye olden days, and yes, part of me is certainly old enough to remember this particular catchphrase, which is where main contractors often said to subcontractors, really sorry, we can't pay you because we haven't been paid ourselves. Section 113 of the Act prohibited pay when paid as an excuse or in terms of a contractual term, but there is an important exclusion there. So in other words, if the third party payer themselves becomes insolvent, then the main contractor could rely on their insolvency as a genuine and appropriate and applicable reason not to pay the subcontractor. But you do need to have an express clause in the contract. Going back now to the important parts of Section 110 and 111, Section 110A, subsection 2A, confirms that a payment notice must specify 1. The sum that the payer considers to be due at the payment due date in respect of the payment, and the basis on which that sum is calculated. Throughout the remaining 40 or so minutes of this seminar, I will be repeating that a number of times. Any payment notice, remembering that the payment notice does include an application for payment or the notice that then is issued in relation to that application, it must specify the sum due and the basis on which that sum is calculated. Section 111.4 covers pay less notices. And a pay less notice must specify, and you'll see the terminology is very similar here. The pay less notice must specify the sum that the payer considers to be due on the date the notice is served and the basis on which that sum is calculated. Very, very similar terminology. So whether I'm looking at an application, a payment notice or a pay less notice, it shouldn't take me more than 30 seconds to actually see the sum due and also to make sure that there is backup to that particular figure, the basis on which the sum is calculated. Looking in detail then at applications for payment, you must ensure that you understand the contract requirements. Earlier on today, I was on to a company who were owed about £50,000. They finished their works in February. Money should have been paid at the end of March, and they haven't been paid. And as you can imagine, they're not happy about that, and they've asked me to get involved and assist in the process of making sure that the money's come in. I have asked this particular subcontractor to give me a copy of the contract and a copy of the application for payment that has been issued, because without those particular items, I can't then advise them as to whether they are in a good position or whether they've tripped over some of the requirements. So you must identify the contract procedure in relation to the application for payment. You need to actually write out, what does the contract actually prescribe? Does it even allow an application for payment? And certainly some contracts actually don't deliberately mention applications for payment, and you're then reliant on the payment notice. I think it's a matter of good housekeeping to make sure that you are actually clear as to what the certification process is. And if any of you have attended pre-tender meetings, pre-start meetings, pre-contract meetings, tender clarification meetings, that would be a very good place to make sure that you understand the certification process. Who is responsible for checking the application? Is it then approved maybe by the site manager? Is it countersigned if it's over a certain value? Does the contract itself actually say that an application is a condition precedent to payment? That wording, condition precedent, hugely important. Make sure that you are clear as to what needs to happen before monies come in. Is an application a condition precedent? Is there anything else in there? The bullet point below talks about a VAT invoice. I have seen a number of contracts and subcontracts that specify that no monies become due until the VAT invoice is issued. That means that no monies become due, no payment will go into your bank. Another possibility is the requirement to have signed and returned the order as well. Again, another very, very common issue. So for each valuation period, it's important that you submit the application for payment on time, provide full substantiation, follow the rules in the contract in terms of the date that you're issuing the application and also the method of service, and ensure that you've got proof that the application was sent. I had a question on a webinar in the last couple of weeks, and someone said, the postal system is being delayed. What can I do about it? Obviously, none of us are in a position where we can sort out the issues relating to couriers or the Royal Mail, nor are we in a position to open our clients' offices that have closed because of COVID-19 issues. My view on this is very, very simple, that even where the contract requires an application to be issued by recorded delivery, you must still do that. But in addition, also send your applications by email as well. So again, you've got proof that actually the email was sent. Hopefully you've also got proof then that actually there was somebody in the office that signed the recorded delivery slip as well. In terms of the structure of the application for payment, what I've got on the next two slides essentially are some ideas. You'll see at the top there, it does say that you need to check this. So I would be expecting to see the client contact name, the company address, potentially even the email address could be listed there as well. On the right-hand side, the project name, possibly the client reference number, the date of the application, when you are valuing the works up to, and if I'm using NEC terminology, of course, you're valuing the works up to the assessment date. I would also like it to be very clear as to what the due date is, what the final date for payment is, and also the application number as well. Now, it might be in your particular contracts that it specifies that there are other requirements that have to go in there. You need to check your particular contracts to make sure that you're complying with those provisions. In terms of the detail, I'm sure that the vast majority of firms on the call, you will already have your own templates. I would use what you can see on the screen here effectively as a bit of a checklist. So if it's an NEC contract, you can see on the left-hand side, I've referred to completed activities, compensation events, and then I've also put the word other because there might be potential compensation events, potential instructions that you've been given, but they've just not matured yet into actual formal compensation events yet. Obviously, the bottom of the slide is potentially more appropriate for subcontractors because I've referred there to discount, which may or may not apply. Again, retention for main contractors and also for subcontractors, again, may or may not apply. Importantly, you can see the line there for previously paid. A very, very common issue that I come across is either that the subcontractor or main contractor only takes it up to the gross amount due and either doesn't refer to the amount previously paid, or instead actually says previously certified or previous application. hugely important, you must put there the previously paid, because that is then what gives you the sum due, which I emphasised a few slides ago. You can see towards the right-hand side then I've got 3 empty columns. If I was the main contractor's QS sitting on site receiving the subcontractor's applications, or indeed if I am the project manager on an NEC contract and I'm receiving the contractor's application for payment, what I would like to know is, what are the original contract values? Where does the contractor or the subcontractor think that the likely final account is going to be? And then also what you're applying for in this particular month or this particular assessment period. So I would want all of those facts on the front sheet. At the bottom, there is a little reminder about the fact that if you're not paid in full by the final date for payment, that you reserve the right to claim interest. And I've referred to the Late Payment of Commercial Debt Interest Act at the bottom. I have put there the current interest rate is a very low percentage at 8.1%. Obviously, for other applications from previous months, it may well be a different interest rate that will apply. Again, remember, in your different NEC options, there are different requirements. So option A is the example I've given you, which talks about completed activities and compensation events. Option B, we're looking at the remeasured work completed, proportion of any lump sums, and also compensation events. And then option C and D, you've got, now this does take a little minute to read and understand. Option C and D referred to the total defined cost, which the project manager forecasts will have been paid by the contractor before the next assessment date plus the fee. So take care there, if you're a main contractor and you are going to pay your subcontractors on a period of time over 30 days, that it might be that you are always working a month behind on that. Of course, we're looking at the amount to subcontractors, the schedule of cost components, and as you reach the end of the project, of course, you're also going to look at the pain gain mechanism as well. I mentioned before this very important phrase, condition precedent. It may well be in your contract or in your subcontract that it says something like, no payment will be made or no monies become due until the relevant performance bond and collateral warranties have been provided and executed. Under NEC, of course, you have to provide a programme. Otherwise, the project manager or the contractor down the line to the subcontractor can also remove 25% from your payments. I mentioned earlier the signing of the order, the signing of the contract might be a condition precedent to payment. And then finally, insurance information. Again, that might be in there as a bespoke terms and conditions. In terms of the time scale, I'm going to use that word again, bespoke, because every single time I do a payment chart, it is always slightly different. It is annoying in an NEC contract that there isn't a space in the contract data part 1 or part 2 to actually insert the application for payment dates or the due dates or the assessment dates. Essentially, they are decided by the project manager within the assessment interval from when the contractor starts on site. This again is something that I would want you to sort out at a very early point. So it could be any of a month after starting on site, the last working day of each month, possibly even the 15th of each month. You need to make sure that you have actually got an agreement on those dates. I already mentioned the method of service. Is it going to be by email, by hand, by post, or possibly even a document management system? Again, you need to check your contracts. You need to make sure you comply with the contractual requirements. And I think as an extra over, certainly at the moment, but actually probably all the time, it's a good idea to send by email as well. Within the notes, I've also included a couple of payment charts. Remember, this is the standard unamended NEC 3 that we're looking at. So on the screen in front of you, you can see the normal chronological sequence of events. We start off on the left-hand side with reference to the application for payment. That's covered under clause 50.4 of the contract. Within the application for payment, you are, I nearly said guessing there, you are sensibly working out what works will have been done by the assessment date. So your application for payments may well include an element of assessment in terms of what work you'll think will be done in the next couple of days. There is then a 7-day period before you get to the due date, and clause 51.1 confirms that that's the project manager's certificate or notice of payment. The 7-day period comes from clause Y 2.2, because of course what we're looking at here are Construction Act compliant contracts. From the due date, under statute, it is a minimum of 5 days for a payer notice to be produced. That particular part is not covered in the NEC contract. They actually cover it through 51.1 through the project manager's certificate. That needs to be sufficiently detailed. Again, I'll repeat the sum due and the basis on which that sum is calculated. From the due date, it's a 14-day standard period to get to the final date for payment. That probably is one of the most popularly altered clauses in an NEC3 contract, because of course that payment period will often be extended to 28 days. Again, Y 2.2 covers that. The final part on this particular slide is all about the pay less notice. Under a standard NEC3 contract, that has to be served a minimum of 7 days before the final date for payment. What I would do in relation to this particular chart, if I was sat there now as a site quantity surveyor, in terms of the applications for payment I'm making up the line, I would actually look at including that chart in my applications for payment, but I would include a spreadsheet at the bottom of the chart, and I'd have all of the dates properly scheduled out. You can see on the top right hand side, I've also given you references to interest, which is covered at 51.4, and suspension for monies which aren't paid when due. That's covered at Y 2.4 in the contract. The next slide covers the NEC3 subcontract. And you can see that the chart is very, very similar. I'll just point out here a couple of differences. If you can see the assessment date, which is the one with the little blue triangle over the top, the period between the assessment date and the due date is 14 days under the subcontract. And the wording in the cloud is slightly different. It's not now the project manager's certificate, it's now the contractor's certificate. But the rest of this particular slide is the same. And of course, I am expecting that, again, that 14-day period to be amended within subcontracts as well. Moving on to talk about some case law. Again, some of you will have already heard some of the cases that I'm going to go through now. You may have also heard the phrase smash and grab, which isn't the most eloquent phrase that I've ever used in my life, but smash and grab is the terminology that has probably been in existence now for 4 or 5 years, and it essentially means where a subcontractor or a contractor has put in a perfect application for payment and no payment notice or pay less notice has been issued. So the subcontractor or contractor have complied exactly with the requirements of the contract, but the paying party, so that could be the employer, it could be the main contractor, has failed to do their part. In that situation, what can then happen is where there is a continuing failure to pay, the person who's owed the money can decide to take that to adjudication, and a procedural adjudication will then take place, which effectively means that assuming that the application for payment is perfect and there's been no payment notice and no pay less notice, that adjudicator will find in favour of the subcontractor or the main contractor because of the lack of the notices. The adjudicator will not go into detail as to whether the money is due or not. They will be looking at the procedure and the correspondence that has been set. Given the position that we are currently in with COVID-19, some sites open, some sites closed, some partly open, with people being furloughed, with people self-isolating, I think that there will be an increase in this smash and grab method of adjudication. And we can see this very well in the first case, which goes back to 2014. You will have heard of ISG, so one of a major, certainly top 20 contractor in the UK, and the other party is SEEVIC College. And we here had a traditional JCT contract, but importantly, the provisions of what happened in this particular case could equally be applied into NEC. The contract says the sum due is either the amount in the employer's payment notice or pay less notice, or the amount in the application for payment. ISG issued what must have been a perfect application for payment. It was issued on the 13th of May 2014, and the sum was £1,097,696. Of that application, there was over £1 million for loss and expense, what we would normally call prolongation costs and preliminary costs, because the job had run on. SEEVIC failed to issue a payment notice, and the pay less notice was served out of time. SEEVIC refused to pay the amount claimed by ISG, so ISG took it to adjudication. This adjudication was ongoing, so that's an adjudication ISG versus SEEVIC. So that adjudication is ongoing, and I think what happened is that SEEVIC College realised that they were going to lose. So they started a second adjudication. It was still all about application number 13, but whereas the first one was a procedural application, the second adjudication was on the true value. First adjudicator then issues his decision and agrees that ISG were entitled to everything. Remember, that adjudicator did not go into the detail, they simply looked at the procedure. SEEVIC still didn't pay. Second adjudication held that the true value of application 13 was £315,450. I can imagine that ISG really weren't too happy with that particular payment. Anyway, they received a cheque for that amount. ISG weren't happy, so they went to court for summary judgment. The judge held in favour of ISG and concluded that SEEVIC effectively agreed with the value stated in ISG's application because they'd failed to issue a payment notice or pay less notice. Therefore, the question as to the value of ISG's works had been decided in the first adjudication, and therefore the second adjudication for the lower figure was quite simply invalid. SEEVIC had to pay the total sum of £1,097,696.29, and SEEVIC's failure to serve a valid payment notice or pay less notice cost them around £700,000. Of course, there would have been court fees on top because this actually went to court as well. Another couple of cases to be aware of. Leeds City Council and Waco. Well, Waco tried exactly the same thing that ISG had tried. Effectively a smash and grab adjudication. In this particular case, though, whilst Waco won in adjudication, they actually lost in court. The contract had been amended, applications had to be made on the due date, Waco issued an early application, and the court held that the early application was not valid. Leeds City Council had actually paid the money over after the adjudication, and that £500,000 then had to be repaid. The courts are taking a very, very strict line on what constitutes a perfect application. So remember, the sum due, the basis on which it's calculated, when it's going to be served, and how it's going to be served. The Volker Laser Nottingham City Council case in 2016. Here, the VAT invoice was a condition precedent to payment. Whilst Volker Laser's application looked pretty good, served in the right manner, etc., they lost on a smash and grab because no VAT invoice had been issued. Again, that would be a key thing that I would look out for if I was checking through your contracts. Grove Development and Balfour Beatty Regional, very, very important case. If I'm advising subcontractors and main contractors in terms of the contents of their contracts, then I don't want to see what I'm going to call a payment schedule, like the one you can see on the screen there. In this particular case, the two parties did include a payment schedule in the contract. There were 23 applications listed. I know this might be very, very surprising for some people to hear, but sometimes construction projects run over, and this is exactly what happened here. Balfour Beatty applied for interim application number 24. No payment was made. Grove stated that Balfour Beatty had no further entitlement to interim payments because, quite simply, the schedule had run out. And the court agreed with Grove Development. There was no right to any further payments, and the scheme for construction contracts did not apply to fill the gap. Having a schedule there with the 23 applications in there was enough to meet the requirements of the Construction Act. What you need to do is either agree to extend the schedule or agree a form of wording which means that if the job continues after the schedule has run out, then that then will continue. 2017 case, Kersfield Developments and Bray and Slaughter. This was a contract for £5 million. Again, yes, it's a JCT design and build. Principles will still apply in an NEC context. Bray, employed by Kersfield to refurbish and convert a manor house and stable block and to construct some detached houses. Application for payment number 19 went in on the 5th of August for just over 1.2 million. Kersfield served a payment notice by email at 10 to 10 on Friday, the 12th of August. Now, I do want to make some comments about, obviously, quantity surveyors having very sad lives and working at 10 to 10 on a Friday night in the middle of August. But anyway, the payment notice was served by email and a payless notice was served at the same time. Now, in this particular case, the payment notice was quite simply too late. So that falls by the wayside. The payless notice was served, in theory, in time. However, there was a contract amendment, and that contract amendment said that any notice served takes effect as having been given and served if it's sent by hand or email by 4 o'clock on a business day, but otherwise it takes effect on the next business day. Because the email was issued at 10 to 10 on a Friday, the next business day was then Monday, the 15th of August. The payless notice was therefore out of time. Bray took this to adjudication and they won. There was a valid application. There was no valid payment or payless notice that was issued. It was held in court that the adjudicator's decision was upheld. There was a valid application and no valid payment notice had been issued. Bray were also awarded costs. The court held that the application was sufficiently clear and unambiguous in form, substance, and intent. The next bullet point I'm not so keen on, to be quite honest. The application 19 did include some lump sums. There was 150,000 in there for disruption and 307,965 pounds for additional labour and supervision. There was no further detail on either of those sums. However, the court held that that was Bray's best assessment of the value of claims at that time and actually did find in Bray's favour. If you read the judgment on this particular case, and it is only a short judgment, you'll find that Bray were entitled to be paid £1,131,751.96. There was a reason for the difference between the sum claimed and the sum actually paid, and that was that Kersfield had paid the rest of the sum in the interim, i.e. during the course of the adjudication. In this particular case, BRAY also were entitled to claim the adjudicator's fees and expenses as well, in the sum of some 17,000 plus interest on top. The next few slides, I am going to leave them in the pack, but they refer to a case called Grove Developments and S&T. A very, very long case. What I'm going to say about this particular one is this does mirror essentially the ISG and SEEVIC case in terms of the validity of payment notice and pay less notices. Whilst at adjudication, the pay less notice was held to be invalid. You can see that on the bottom bullet point on the slide in front of you. This was overturned in court, and it was actually held, I go over a couple of slides here, it was actually held that the pay less notice was adequate in court. It didn't have the figures in the pay less notice itself. Instead, it referred to an earlier document, and the court decided that that was fine. This particular case then went on to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal agreed with Judge Coulson in the Technology and Construction Court. An important thing, though, that does come out of this is what happens after a smash and grab on procedural notices has taken place. The court did hold that a smash and grab on procedural notices will be successful, but that's not the end of the story. What you can then have is a second adjudication on the true value. Importantly, this must take place after the first adjudication is completed. So you have to have done the whole of the first adjudication, and the losing party must have paid out before they can then take a second adjudication. Now, I am thoroughly expecting this particular part of the Construction Act to be reviewed, and we've actually had a review, and we are waiting for further legislation. Normally at this point, I'm normally saying Brexit is the problem, and that's why we haven't had the Further Construction Act. Actually, it's probably now COVID related rather than Brexit related. The findings in this particular case were then reiterated in the Davenport and GREER case. Adjudication number 1, smash and grab. In this particular case, the owners of the property, Mr. and Mrs. GREER, didn't pay, and instead they started a second adjudication, which they won. The court, however, held that the second adjudication was effectively thrown in the bin because they hadn't complied with the first adjudication. So essentially, these two particular cases do agree with each other. Yes, you will win on a smash and grab procedural adjudication if your application is perfect and there's no payment notice or pay less notice issued. You must pay out the money on that first adjudication, and only then can you go to adjudication again. So what would my advice be after looking at the slides that we've gone through so far? Very, very important that if you're the payer, now remember that if you are a contractor, you are a payer when you're looking at your subcontractor payments. And the rules of the game, as far as I'm concerned, are very, very simple. You must get your payer notice right. You've got to serve it within the 5 days. You must issue it in the right manner, and you must make sure it's fully detailed. My view would be that you would only use the pay less notice for catastrophic events. So where a wall has fallen down or something along those lines. In terms of payees, then I want you guys to make sure that when you're checking your subcontracts, or of course for contractors looking up the line to their clients, make sure that your contracts specify you can issue an application for payment, and that you have a continuing right to valuations even after practical completion. Make your application wear a halo. I have upgraded my graphic at this point, but it's still pretty poor, I have to say. Make sure that your application looks and smells like an application for payment in substance, form, and intent. Serve it on the right date, issue it on the right date, issue it in the right manner, make sure it's fully detailed, sum due basis on which it's calculated. Predict the value to the correct date. Put the due date on your applications. The next bullet point down says split the work. Now that refers to the fact that now and again you might be working on a job which is partly Construction Act compliant and partly not. Yes, I would then be looking for essentially 2 applications or 2 parts of an application. Put the correct title on your application and watch out for those pesky VAT notices as well. The only other thing that I am going to add at this point, which is COVID related, is something called PPN 0220. Definitely, it would be worth you Googling this particular note after the seminar. It's a Cabinet Office issued procurement policy note, and it's all about supplier relief due to COVID-19. This particular note is applicable to the 30th of June 2020, so it is a temporary change. It refers to contracting authorities and it includes central government, local authorities, national health trusts, etc. And it's all about supporting cash flow and paying suppliers as quickly as possible. Under this particular procurement policy note, if you have monies outstanding from central government or local authorities, you should now be getting in touch with those authorities and saying, look, I've read PPN 0220, please can you pay us as quickly as possible? And this note supports that. It also supports more regular invoicing. So if traditionally you're invoicing on a monthly basis, potentially this note could help you agree a fortnightly application for payment. If your applications are particularly complicated, there is a possibility that you could agree an average monthly payment, which is calculated over the previous 3 months, and then that's used for the following months, but you would have to agree to open your books at that point. I see this generally looking at main contractors, but the note does say that funding should flow down to subcontractors. So if you are a subcontractor working on a public authority project, I would certainly be approaching the main contractor and reminding them of this PPN 0220 note and finding out what they're doing about it. Obviously, if you're the contractor, please do approach the relevant government body and download the public procurement policy note as well. And that concludes the pre-prepared slides that I wanted to go through. Do we have any questions, Gemma?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, absolutely. If you wanted to put the excellent. Oh, brilliant question. Thank you, Matt. So Matt's question is, how is the interest calculated on late payments? I like this question because it normally involves a spreadsheet. So starting point is have a look at your contract. Again, every contract that you look at is bespoke. If it's an NEC contract, the default interest rate is a bit miserable actually. It's only 2% above the Bank of England base rate. However, there is provision in the contract data for the employer to write in a higher level of interest. And I would tend to see authorities writing in 3%, 4%, 5%. That then would be a substantial remedy. I'm going to say anything above 4% would be a substantial remedy. Okay. If your contracts are silent on interest, that's when the Late Payment of Commercial Debts Interest Act kicks in, or alternatively, if the rate of interest is too low. So if it's not a substantial rate of interest, again, that 8% over the Bank of England base rate will kick in. A very useful website to look at is payontime.co.uk. I'll say that again, payontime.co.uk. You have to register onto the website, but it's free. And there's actually an interest calculator there. Unless the interest is specified as being calculated daily, it will be simple interest. And so effectively, you take the amount of money that's outstanding. Importantly, you add VAT. You times it by the number of days it's outstanding over 365, and then you times it by the applicable interest rate. Also importantly, you don't have to report and pay VAT on the interest that you're paid out, because it's a damages claim and interest doesn't come within the VAT Act. Okay, hopefully I've done that one, Gemma. Is there any others?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, a great question. Can that you request that retention is released early under PPN 0220? I definitely think you can request that amount is actually released early. No problems with that at all. I have a feeling, I'm just going to see if I can actually flick onto the relevant website here. I think that it actually does refer to retention in the note. If you just bear with me a second. I mean, what it certainly does do is it talks about ensuring invoices submitted are paid immediately on receipt. Reconciliation can take place in a slower time. I would certainly, if you've got monies outstanding from any government bodies at the moment, that would be an exercise that I think would be very worthwhile doing. Certainly any retention that's overdue, absolutely use PPN 02. Any retention that's going to be due in the next couple of months, again, no harm whatsoever in requesting early release at all. Obviously, there's no information there as to how it's being processed by local authorities. The general information that I'm getting from colleagues is that actually some local authorities are being very good about that. Okay, next one on the slide there, where the scheme applies. Can you recap on what the overall period is from submission of application for payment through to final date of payment? Right, luckily here I have a copy of the Act and the scheme, and I'm just going to flick to the relevant parts here. So, adjudication, right, so it comes under Part 2 on the payment. You're going to look at paragraphs 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, first of all, in relation to when monies become due. Now, it talks about potentially a relevant period being stated or the making of a claim by a payee. Okay, and that's covered in paragraph 4 of the scheme. You've then got the final date for payment in paragraph 8, which confirms that the period between the due and the final date for payment there is 17 days. What I do have, which you might want to get hold of a copy of, I know that some of you, see if I can angle this properly on my screen here. I know that some of you have been to the payment seminars before that we've done for Seeker, and I've actually handed out a copy of the Act and the scheme. And if you wanted to put that on your feedback to Gemma, I'll make sure that you get a copy of the Act and the scheme. And quite simply, all I've done there is actually download it and make the relevant amendments into the actual document from the legislation.gov.uk website. So, John, you're generally looking at a period of 7 days in terms of your application, and then a period of 17 days from the due date to the final date for payment. The only thing I'm going to add in there is, normally the contracts that I see, they partly comply with the Act. And what you're then doing is your gap filling. So you're only taking some of the scheme and gap filling it in. Okay. Okay, does PPN 0220 cover the public sector only or all? Right, I'm actually going to split it into 3 here. You've got what I'm going to call the very, very straightforward traditional part of the public sector. And in that category, I'm going to put local authorities, and I'm also going to put central government. PPN 0220 definitely covers those two. You then move into, I'm going to say, a second category, and I'm going to read this out from paragraph 3 of PPN 02, and it says, PPN is applicable to all contracting authorities, including central government departments, executive agencies, non-devolution departmental public bodies, local authorities, NHS bodies, and the wider public sector, excluding devolved administrations. Now, if I was to think about, let's say, Network Rail, I think that that would probably fall into the public sector and PPN02 would apply. If I'm then thinking about devolved administrations, maybe the likes of your United Utilities, then you're into that second category. My understanding is some of those types of organisations, so what we traditionally would have called the water board, some of those are acting extraordinarily fairly at the moment and processing payments very, very quickly. I believe others aren't acting quite as straightforwardly. It is not clear in the note as to what bodies fit in and what bodies are excluded. They haven't put a list of applicable bodies, unfortunately. The third sector I will cover at this point are what I'm going to call private developers. PPN 0220 does not apply to private developers at all. So if you were doing some work on a Lidl superstore or a Sainsbury's superstore, no, PPN 0220 wouldn't be covered. So I think I've given you a very clear answer about the local authorities and central government and about private developers. We definitely have a bit of fog in the middle. Okay. Right, another question we have here. One of the case studies shows that the application for payment was sent earlier than the application date. Can it be sent before the application date? And if so, how many days? Right. Two parts to this. The case that we looked at before was Leeds City Council and Waco. That contract had been amended, so it said that the application must be served on the due date, and you couldn't do an earlier one. The majority of contracts, though, that I do come across, whether main contracts or subcontracts, do actually say that you've got to serve the application for payment before the due date. Okay, so you can serve them early. Some of them say a maximum of 7 days before. So again, the devil is in the detail on this. You need to look at your own contracts. Let's say that it just said you could serve your application for payment before the assessment date, and it didn't actually give you any detail on timing. I think, yes, you could serve it even 2 weeks early, but you would have to make it very, very clear on your email and on the face of the document and on the recorded delivery version that this is a very early application and that the assessment date and the due dates are whatever they are. Okay, so maybe the assessment date is the 22nd of April and the due date is the 29th of April. So make sure that that's absolutely express on the form itself. So just to summarise this one, it's going to depend on your contract. Yes, it can be sent early. If there's no specific how many days early specified, I think 7 days early would be fine. I think a longer period, particularly in the current climate, would be fine as well. But you must make sure that it's very clear on the document itself as to how far in advance it actually is. Do we have any more, Jem? Oh gosh, there's a long one. Okay, hang on. Right. If the contractor I feel like, Fleming, I'm on one of those government daily briefings. Okay. If the contractor fails to submit an application beyond the application which a smash and grab was implemented, does the employer reserve the right to assess the works completed in the absence of a new application at the time, which the new application was due, or do they have to wait until the smash and grab adjudication has been concluded and then commence? Right, okay, right, I understand what you're saying here, Matt. So my starting point on this is a smash and grab is only possible where the employer or the employer's representative has failed to actually issue a valid payment notice or pay less notice. Okay, so smash and grab is not possible regardless of what the contractor does on their application. If the employer issues a valid payment notice and or a valid pay less notice, smash and grab has disappeared. Okay, it's not important. It's not an issue. Smash and grab only comes in where there's no payment notice, there's no pay less notice, but there is a beautiful halo wearing application for payment. So the situation we appear to have here is that there's no valid application, there's no payment notice, there's no pay less notice, but then the contractor comes in and issues a late application for payment. What we've got there is something called a payee notice in default. Normally what happens with a payee notice in default, and hopefully everybody is still with me at this point, is the payment notice and the pay less notices move out so that the employer still has further time. If those dates are met, then yes, smash and grab adjudication could be done on the payee notice in default. However, Matt, just going to the bones of Matt's question here, if the contractor doesn't start a smash and grab, can the employer themselves start a smash and grab on the basis of a true value before a procedural adjudication has been started? That very, very long explanation was basically to say, we are not sure because we've not had a case on that yet. Commentators have gone both ways on this particular issue. I am going to go back to basics and say, I'm sure it's not going to happen to anyone who has suffered me on one of these webinars or a live seminar, because you will have served the correct notices. If I was sat on the side of the employer and notices had failed to have been issued, I would be very nervous about either starting a true value adjudication or indeed sitting there and waiting. It's going to depend on the value as to what you do next. Okay, Matt, if you want to get in touch with me after the seminar to go through that query in a little bit more detail, I'd be happy to. Okay, I'm asking now with nervousness, Gemma, do we have any other questions? And I'm happy to take any more.
We do not. I think that last one of the longest paragraph
Thank you.
people. I think that was our last one. We have had one other comment just from Guy, who's obviously our Seeker director in the Northwest, who stated that Seeker are looking for feedback on any public sector clients who aren't currently adhering to PPN02. So if anyone does have any feedback on that, please drop me a line and I can pass it through to Guy, just because it's something that Seeker are looking at with regards to payments to contractors. So if anyone's got any feedback on that, that would be fantastic.